Welcome everyone to this second session of Family Business Training, the second in a series of 7. And today we will be discussing the subject of designing family business ownership. We are obviously dealing with a number of subjects, and today we are starting with a foundational subject, a fundamental subject, which is how family business can go about designing their family business ownership. This is a fundamental subject because the way family business is set up will many a times, and the way they set up ownership will many times determine how family businesses will operate in the future and have very long-lasting implications. Now, obviously, it is very difficult to bring every family business with their different complexities and the range of family businesses from small to medium. Sometimes even we have very large family businesses in the world. Bring them all into a number of models that can fit in within a presentation. However, if we take a generic perspective and we look at ownership models, we today have 4 different ownership models, which by and large encapsulate all, or at least the most popular ownership models we normally find in family businesses. The first ownership model is the sole owner. That is not just, when I mean sole owner ownership model, I do not just mean someone who is a sole trader, but even those family businesses that operate in an ownership structure where they have a single owner, and family business that move from one generation to the next by identifying a single owner for each generation. Then we have the partnership model, whereby the people involved as being family business owners are only those that actually decide to become actively involved in the managing of the business. The third model is the distributed model, is the inclusive model to the ultimate extent, if you want to call it that way. It is where any business, any family business member, so anyone who is a member of the family, is actually by right given the ownership status. And so there is no distinction between who is involved, who is not involved, who is firstborn, who is not firstborn, or whatever other type of distinction. Basically, everyone is given the same status, the same ownership, and the same voting rights. And finally, there is the concentrated model, whereby we still many a times find that every family member and every descendant is given some form of ownership, but then you have a smaller subset of people, a smaller group, sometimes it could be even one person, whereby these persons, besides ownership, have better, higher control, normally through voting rights. And so, although everyone under the concentrated model, or all family members, are shareholders, not all shareholders and family members have the same voting rights. Now, here I explained ownership models. However, I'm pleased to say that today with us we also have the Family Business Office Regulator, Dr. Joe Gerardo, and I thank him for finding time to be with us today. And we will use a bit of his time so that he can explain to us the legal, this time, not ownership model, so the legal corporate structures that family businesses can have, and most importantly, since he heads the Family Business Office, what are the legal corporate structures that the Family Business Act contemplates as being family business, as being actual family business and defined as family businesses under the Family Business Act. Joe, thanks for joining us and for your time, and I leave it up to you to explain this legal part.
Hi, Silva. First of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity and giving the Family Business Office this opportunity to explain further some aspects of the Family Business Act, which, as you correctly stated, falls under the remit of this office. As you also correctly stated, we have to distinguish between different models, which you have been explaining very well, and which I'm sure you will go into further detail during today's session, and perhaps even during future sessions. But there's also the legal aspect falling under the Family Business Act. And what I will be talking about are the different models or different structures of legal structures, mainly, of businesses that the Family Business Act accepts for registration under the Act. Obviously, not every family business is required to register under the Act. It's actually voluntary to register under the Act. The benefits, I will not go into them today, but perhaps in the future we'll have some opportunity to go into that as well. But those family businesses which register under the Act would perhaps have certain benefits that other businesses which are not registered would not have. The Act itself starts with a very basic principle. The basic principle is that you need to have at least two family members, two related family members. It could be two spouses, okay, which are still considered to be family members. It could be two brothers, a brother and a sister, etc., who are involved directly in the family business. Now, when we say directly, it means having, if you're operating under a partnership, they would be partners. If you're operating under a limited liability company, they would be both shareholders, and at least one of them would have the management, day-to-day management in his hands. So he would be directly involved in the day-to-day management of that business. None of these two family members can have more than 80% ownership in the business, okay? And I think here it's important to delve a bit into why. Why does the Act distinguish between who has more than 80% shareholding, and why does it require not having more than 80% shareholding? The reason being is that the Act, or the legislator, believes that for family businesses to have a better chance of success when the business is being passed to future generations, so when it comes to succession mainly, there's a better chance if the ownership and control is distributed for that the succession in that business to take place than if ownership is concentrated under, for example, as you have mentioned, a sole ownership or sole trader structure, where you have one person who has the main control of the business in his hands. Exactly. So that is the idea, and here I wanted to make it very clear, as the audience will understand, and as you will be explaining, it doesn't mean that what the Family Business Act defines as a family business, it's the only definition that exists in the world. Far from it, unseen. As we know, there are various definitions. In fact, when the Act was being drafted, one of the issues was to come up with a definition, because there were so many different definitions of what a family business is, that we had to see what the legislator wants, what are the objectives in Malta, what do we want to achieve, and based on those objectives, a decision in consultation with a number of stakeholders was taken to establish this particular definition of a family business. The Family Business Act itself, under Article 3, when we speak about the family business, we're talking about Chapter 565 of the Laws of Malta. It gives various structures, legal structures, which a family business can operate under so that it can then register under the Act. It tells us that any family business needs to be trading at least for 3 years before it can register under the Act. Reason behind that is that obviously it has to be a going concern, and it would be to a certain extent futile to register a family business under the Act upon its inception, when, as we know, some businesses will succeed and others will fail. And we know that in the first 3 years of a business, those 3 years are very crucial. So in those 3 years, very often a business will either fail or succeed. So any business which has been trading for at least 3 years under one of these structures I'm going to mention now, where you have at least 2 family members who are shareholders or partners and have direct involvement, would be eligible to register under the Act. And here we are talking about partnerships, whether registered or unregistered. This means that a partnership can have the form of an agreement between 2 family members who say, listen, we have a business together, we're running the business together. The partnership agreement would also state what involvement there is by each member, so the percentage of ownership, where the control lies, so who's going to be managing the day-to-day business, etc., etc., or it can be even registered. So obviously it would be registered with the Malta Business Registry. Then you have the limited liability companies, public companies, you have foundations, and also trusts. So what we're saying here is that basically any legal structure which comes in the form of a partnership, or where you have ultimate beneficial owners, who are at least 2 members of the family, would practically be eligible to register under the Act. At the moment, as things stand, sole traders, so those who are self-employed with a VAT number, even if, because we have this question very often, even if they employ another family member, but there is no control and ownership by that family member in at least 20% of the ownership, then that business would not qualify as a family business under the Act. It might qualify as a family business in itself under a different definition, but not under the Act.
So even if it is a family business and it's not a sole trader because they have a limited liability company, but the shareholding is 100% owned by one family member, then it is not eligible to be defined as a family business under the Family Business Act.
Correct. And that kind of company, we would refer to it as a single member company in this case, but totally correct. A single member company where you have ownership by one family member would not qualify. One thing I wanted to add as well is that the Act also envisages participation by third parties who are not family members, and also by employees of the company. Okay. And in its totality, it envisages up to 15% ownership, approximately, okay, between employees and third parties who are not family members, ownership in that company, and that would still qualify
as a family business.
As a family business under the Act.
Okay.
Obviously, Silvan, from here, I want to thank the audience that is following us. I'm sure there will be questions, and that is why we have these sessions. Any questions that they may have, they can contact our office, they can contact the chamber, and we will direct their queries according to their needs. And obviously, we can even meet them and explain further to them to see whether such business would qualify under the Act or otherwise.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gerarda. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your very informative and insightful information. Obviously, I know you have a very busy schedule, but I still thank you for finding the time to give this very valuable input to family businesses.
Thank you. Looking forward to the next session, Silvan.
Well, even I, obviously, a lot of work and preparation has been done in order to try to present the best possible sessions for our family businesses. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Gerarda.
Bye.
We will obviously continue in our session. So I explained the format that that ownership formats that family businesses can take. I will now move on in explaining why choosing the right format, ownership format, is important, because it is not merely a formality, or it is not something that you set, I don't know, ages ago. Ownership and ownership structures are very dynamic, especially as businesses grow and have different needs. They have a lot of implications on the business, on the family. And so it is extremely important that when setting the ownership rights structure, we not only keep an open mind, but we try to have a forward-looking vision. We understand what are the implications of the type of ownership choices we have to make, implication on the business and on the family. We understand the implications not just in the short term, but also on the long term. And we have to see over time if the ownership structure we have been operating with for a number of years, if it is still relevant, if it is still serving us well, if it is going to take us into the future in a strong way, or if it needs to be changed. And please, if it needs to be changed, let's start working as soon as possible to have it change, because it is one hell of a process. When trying to choose what type of ownership model you want to operate with, you want to use, you need to give yourself answers to three important questions. And I call these the three core questions for you to choose the ownership model. Do you want your business value, all the past earnings, the reserved earnings you have accumulated, and assets you have acquired through your hard work over the years and decades that you have been managing and working in your family business, to remain integrated together in one structure? Or do you want to separate them in different structures? That is a very important and very strategic, I would say, decision. And so it is an important consideration any family business needs to take, especially in particular junctures, which will impinge on the ownership model for family businesses. The second question is answering who can and will be an owner. Do you envisage that any family member can be an owner, or will only the family members who work and operate in the business be owners? Because obviously this yet again will impinge on the ownership structure you want to set up. And finally, who from all the owners will have control? Will we go for an inclusive, a shared ownership control model, whereby basically anyone who is a shareholder can have a level of control pari passu with the level of shareholder? Or will the actual control and decision, ultimate decision, be consolidated in a few hands or a single person, it could be, by having different type of shares and different voting rights assigned to them, okay? Obviously, there are pluses and minuses on each type of method, but these are considerations, and I'm putting them at the front, at the beginning, on purpose, because these are considerations that need to be taken when deciding which ownership model the family business needs to go for. And so, as principle, you need to be very clear whether you believe that the way forward for your business is whether you want to integrate, and so you use an ownership model, an inclusive ownership model, which integrates things together, or whether it is better if you separate. And here I normally start getting, when I deal with clients, the $100 million question. What is best for me? Well, obviously you would need to make the decision depending on your situation. What I can tell you is the rationale as to why sometimes people decide to integrate and have an inclusive model whereby they include everyone, and so they do not separate, and those the rationale for those family business that do the opposite and decide to separate. Okay, normally those that integrate and use an inclusive model, they give a lot of strength and importance in trying to keep the family united, and they try to, as much as possible, to increase the strength and the volume of the business by keeping it under one cap, if you want to call it, or one grouping. They try as much as possible to have a very homogeneous look as to how wealth is distributed among members of the family, and they give a lot of importance in keeping the family wealth together by keeping their assets together. On the other hand, those that decide to implement a separate, an exclusive model, are afraid that with the inclusive model, you increase the risk of family conflict. Why? Because obviously under the inclusive model, you are you have more people that need to be involved in a decision, which means that there is more chance, more room for conflict to arise because you have to convince more people, you have to persuade more people. People have different family members, have different priorities, different ideas, different agendas. And so the possibility of conflict and obviously the need to have a lot of decisions, difficult decisions taken by a larger group of people gives the chance, there is a probability that conflict arise even more. And so having a separate and exclusive model whereby businesses separate assets, or where you have ownership with different voting rights, and so you have a separate system there as well. I'm sorry. Is in this instance the preferred model in order to reduce the possibility for conflict. You also create the notion that whoever creates, whoever goes toward the separate model, that family members should not expect them to be dependent on the business, that you can only be dependent on the business and you can only expect an income which you can make a real living out of the business if you really give value, if you really work, if you really contribute towards the business. And it reduces, the separate model also reduces a level of complexity to run and manage the business, because decisions can be taken fairly easier rather than convincing and reaching a consensus with all family members who would be shareholders under the inclusive and integrated model. Here, it is basically, I am presenting similar concepts using different wording, basically. Inclusive and exclusive. I'm using different wording because many a times you find that different people use different wording. And so obviously I want to show you that basically they mean the same thing. But when we say, as I said before, integrated and separate, I mean also inclusive and exclusive. And obviously every model comes with its own pluses and minuses, as I've been explaining. I mean, the inclusive model, besides what I've just mentioned, also has the plus that it avoids creating any incentive to try to push yourself into becoming an owner, because basically everyone is going to be an owner just the same under that model. It also means that capital is kept in the business rather than under the divisive model, where people try to have, under the separate model, they try to buy out someone else, and so use the capital of the business to buy out some brother, some sister, some cousin, so that they reduce the number of people they need to convince. They can have access to, under the inclusive model, the talent pool across generations, because everyone is going to be involved. And it avoids conflict over the definition of who is an ownership and who can be an ownership, because under the inclusive model, basically everyone who is a family member can be an owner. However, the exclusive model, since it is exclusive as the name implies, so you have a smaller subset of people who are actually owners, has the advantage that is much easier to align the interests among the owners rather aligning the interest among an enormous amount of owners. It reduces conflicts and the possibility of conflicts, as we already saw, allows obviously the business to focus more on what the business needs and less on dealing with conflicts, with questions, with people who are not understanding, especially from those people who are owners but are not actually involved in the business. And since we're dealing with a smaller group, and normally the group involved are those who are really interested in the business, it ensures that all the family shareholders are actually those who know exactly what is happening in the business and what the business really needs. So one of the decisions to be taken when speaking about family business ownership is, do we want shared control? Do we want balance of power in order to prevent any one person or a subset of persons to take all the decisions himself or herself, which is very much in line with what the Family Business Act wants to prevent, as Dr. Joe Gerarda has just said. Do you want to avoid a situation where owners may decide to sell and may decide that since they want to sell, they better take capital from the business through dividend distribution rather than reinvest it for it to grow, and so they may be threatening its future viability? Or do you want, and so you want a shared control to avoid these circumstances? Are these your major worries? Or you prefer having a single and restricted control because your worries are of a different nature? Right? Your worries are that if you do not have a single or restricted control, so a separate and exclusive model, decision making in the business is going to be close to impossible. And therefore, you need to have this type of model to ensure that decisions are taken quickly in business. Okay. And you are more worried that if more people are involved in the business, there are going to be a lot of conflicts in the business. And so by having a limited or a single authority that ultimately decides in the business, that is a sure way of resolving or avoiding having conflicts. It depends, obviously, your circumstance of your family business and where you believe the greatest needs or the greatest risk lies. If in creating balance of power, in creating a situation of checks and balances, and so if that is you want a shared control, or if it is in decision making and in avoiding conflicts, and in that way you most probably would prefer having a restricted and exclusive ownership control model. And so we put things together, and when we put things together, we normally come up with this matrix where we are putting together on one hand, on one axis, we're putting together whether your ownership criteria is going to be inclusive or exclusive, and we're putting together whether the decision-making control you're going to be using is unified and shared. And as one can see, if you want a unified decision-making control with exclusive ownership criteria, you are obviously starting from the sole owner, whether it's a sole trader or whether it is a company, as we explained before, with one single owner. Normally, businesses are likely to transition over time as they grow, because normally family businesses start out in the lower left hand, they are a startup, they have just the first generation, the inventor, the person that started with the business, and the ownership is normally exclusive to that founder. Normally they start even from a legal perspective as a sole trader, and then they set up a company whereby himself or just himself and his wife are shareholders. And normally they remain that way until the business grows and we start to move into second generation. Having said that, as I explained in the very beginning, there are family business models, ownership models that remain that way even when passing from one generation to the next, whereby they decide they want to remain with a unified and exclusive ownership criteria, and so they always identify a single person who will be leading and taking decision of the family business from one generation to the next, and basically he would be the person taking the business, or she who would be the person taking the business forward. However, normally when businesses grow and they come to make the first generation move to the children or whatever, they move and they normally move to a partnership model, which basically means that there is a connection between the ownership and active participation, but the amount of owners that are now involved in the business obviously grows. Okay, and so we have, although we still have an exclusive ownership criteria, we have a shared decision making, obviously shared now by the second generation. And normally, as businesses grow, okay, they would need to grow, to adapt their family business ownership even further. Some decide to go down the route, which is the full open route, whereby they decide that they want to be completely inclusive, and so go down what is called the distributed model, whereby the ownership criteria is inclusive and all the decision-making control is shared. That means both ownership and control is widely shared by all shareholders, and so that is why we call it the distributed ownership, and basically no one is required to be actively involved and participate, and the shares are just passed down to you through normal family lines. However, some go down the route from sole ownership partnership and then decide to go down the concentrated level, whereby they do an inclusive model of ownership. So they give ownership to all family members, but then when it comes to control, to voting rights, to decision making, they prefer a unified, whereby they have a smaller subset, normally people who are very much involved in the business, or one person who actually then has the voting rights, and is the person who ultimately can call the shots. There are particular circumstances whereby I strongly advise family members to really revisit their ownership structure and see if it is forward-looking, if it is set up in a way which will allow the business to grow on strong foundations and to have a future transition. In fact, the first junction is when preparations are ongoing for the next generation that is coming into the business. We'll speak about succession planning in session 6, but obviously when it comes to ownership structures, a good point where it is time to revisit, whereby your ownership structure is the one you need, is when the next generation is coming into the business. When obviously the business has grown and is growing, and the number of people involved in the business, the complexity of the business, especially if you're diversifying into other business areas, and so the complexity of the business changes significantly. That is obviously a good juncture where you need to consider your ownership structure. When you have capital constraints, because you need to move forward, you need to buy out owners of the business, and unless you do that, the business cannot grow any further. It is obviously a very important juncture at which you need to check and see whether you have the right ownership model. Obviously, when you're stuck in conflict and when when you decide that the time has come because of circumstances that the family business needs to be, there's a transition from family, the ownership remains within the family, but the leadership, the management is now being, is going to be handed to non-family members. And so the ownership structure can change so that there is a even bigger distinction between the family level and the family ownership and where it can, what it needs and expects from the business and the management side, which will not be family members. Here I have, in order to try to explain what what are the implications of each ownership time, I have gone through each ownership model and tried to come up with the benefits and challenges. Why? Because many times I, as a family business advisor, I get asked, but which is the best model for me and whatever. And really and truly, there isn't a best model. This is not a one size fits all. It depends on your circumstances. So a sole owner, when you have a single family, whether it's a sole trader or whether it's a company with a single shareholder, this works best when the business needs to have a person that takes, control, and when the business has not grown enough that it can, distribute profits to other owners, even if they are not actively participating in the business. Okay, this type of ownership model is when especially family businesses are still in its infancy and they have not grown a lot. However, if the business grows and this is creating profits and it can create liquidity for owners and it wants to start thinking about its future beyond its present owner, obviously, if we remain with this model, then that can create challenges. Because if we remain with this model, how the successor, the person who's going to be the anointed one, the chosen one, becomes central. Because, you're not managing a monarchy here. At the end of the day, you're managing a business. And so, the sole owner will still need, that was given the baton, and the chosen one, the anointed one, will still need to most probably have in an informal way some benefits given to the rest of the family. In the case of parents, some parents, for example, pass on assets to children who are not the chosen one, assets that are outside of the business, some property, for example. Others decide that they still want to keep the between one generation and the next the sole ownership model, but they also the assets within the business, but expect the sole owner to still take care of everyone else in some way or form. And normally this expectation is not documented, but it's sort of written. I'm sorry, it is sort of included in the family culture. Then we have the partnership model, which was the model where we are only those family members who are actively participating in the business can be owners. And here the benefits are almost obvious in the sense that only those who participate can become owners of the business. And so basically you're making sure that those who get the greatest benefits of the business are those that are really, sweating and putting their energy into this business. And, we can think about distributing profits to non-owners when the business grows and can handle also people who are not participating. The challenge here is that obviously there needs to be clarity as to how people make it to the ownership groups. And so how we define active participation and non-active participation. And obviously, one of the key difficulties here is that obviously as the business grows, those who are not involved today will have a higher sort of price that they need to pay if they want to become owners into the future, because they would then need to become owners of a business that has grown and has more value. So that is obviously one of the downsides of this model. Then we have the distributed model, which is basically an all-inclusive model, basically that anyone that is part of the family can be a shareholder, and that everyone is kept within all assets are kept within one structure of the family business, and that all family descendants are owners and have the same decision rights, the same voting rights. Here, obviously, the challenge is quite obvious. It is difficult to align the interests of different owners, especially if the numbers are large, who have different interests, different engagement levels, with no one having a majority shareholding. And so the key word here is working to build consensus, which is obviously very difficult, which requires skills in communication and persuasion. And if there are huge numbers, one of the biggest problems is that the ownership group can risk becoming distant from the business and from the management of the business, and can also lose control over what is happening in the business. And finally, we have the concentrated model, which has the same advantages similar to the sole trader. Decisions can be taken quickly by one person on a very concentrated number of people. Obviously, here you solve a lot of problems that we are just discussed on the distributed type, with possible conflicts, difficult to find consensus and whatever. But obviously you create others, because there is the big question of how do we decide who is to exercise the control, and so who has more voting rights. And this deciding who gets this over from one generation to the next many a times gets even more complicated. And so having family constitutions, for example, who are adopted to create criteria as to who gets these control voting rights is very important. Who is most qualified? Who gives more contribution to the business? How is this defined? And also there is the challenge of not having those owners who do not have the voting rights of the subset of the concentrated amount of people, not to feel disengaged. Okay, and so the importance of having the family room, as we will discuss when we discuss about corporate governance in the next session. This brings us to an end on the second session, at least to the end of my input on the second session, because after my input we will have two interviews with family business owners on their experience of the ownership structures and how the ownership structures have transitioned across generations. And we will be meeting with Isabel De Battista from Mirabel Holdings, and we will be meeting also Natalie Borch-Briffa from the Vassallo Group, who I both kindly thank for their time to answer my questions on the subject.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share our family business model in this perspective. As you rightly said, it is very important for family businesses to have the right structures in place for the business to operate. Our business model probably has a unique characteristic because the way it has been shaped, it was a very inclusive model, and each and every one of the family members became a shareholder when we were 18 years of age. So basically, the business initially belonged to the parents, to our parents, and each and every one of our siblings became an owner as soon as we reached the age of 18. Obviously, both the inclusive and the exclusive models have their advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, our history shows us, our history tells a very nice story, because in our case, although it was an inclusive model, each and every one of the shareholders are very actively involved. And we are all very much participative in the processes, in the structures, and in the full functioning of the business.
I'm coming from the hospitality background, catering, but our family businesses started in the late 1950s in construction, and then my father diversified to our generation into catering and hospitality. It was quite more of the model of the exclusive, where my parents had the A shares and we were included with the B share voting rights. That on the demise of one of the parents, then those A shares transfer to the B shares become A shares. Basically, I'm more for the inclusive than the exclusive, because even though it was exclusive, we kind of worked more on the model of the inclusive, whereby all the family members were included and shareholders. Just the voting rights were different, and the inclusive worked very well over the last years. We have been in business for 41 years. Our anniversary is just passed now. And it worked well because everyone was in the business and working as a shareholder, but obviously contributing daily to the running of a family business. We grew over the years. Then 7 years ago, my family decided that they want to sell up. Our father had passed away. They decided that they want to sell up, and I decided to buy them out. Continuation of family businesses. I'm the eldest. They decided to part ways, and we parted in a very good terms. But even now, I have 2 sons, and I work on the inclusive model, whereby they are involved. It's a smaller now family unit. Before we were 5, obviously siblings, and now I bought out the whole family business, and I just have 2 children. So.
I would say that apart from obviously having a very good vision and a plan way ahead of time, the other great component which has successfully led us to where we are today was the fact that the business was always run on very good governance. As of early days, the business was never made up of just family members. We always had the inclusion of non-family members in the decision-making processes as executive directors and non-executive directors, and the business was throughout run on very rigid good governance principles. So I think that was a very good successful tool that was inbuilt in the structure of the company as of very early days. It was very well oiled and structured platform as of early days, and I think that was the key to facilitate the progress and the developments of the companies as it continues to grow and as it is continually growing even in the present scenarios.
Its communication is key to retain the family unit, even though everyone's parting their ways. It's very important to make things very clear. In my case, I engaged separate consultants for the takeover of the business to be totally separate from the company we used as a family, for transparency and the communication, transparency, honesty, and trying to keep the family unit still unified. Because unfortunately we see a lot of this happening whereby family businesses are not surviving because there's different opinions. So when it came to the decision that my family wanted to sell, I approached. We actually, during the whole procedure, somebody else was interested. I had no problem. Obviously, I did not go and meet the other potential investor that wanted to buy out, because it would have been a conflict of interest. My family took it very well as well, and I said, if they offer the same terms, conditions, and take over, then I would sell with you. So there was no, hard feelings. We're still very united as a family. At this culture, I have now, brought it into my family, which is a small family now, unit within the business. But what is key, even to safeguard a family itself, because it's generations. I am second generation in my family. I have a third generation, my children and my grandchildren as well now. But to safeguard that original family unit, it's important that this transition of takeover, of sale, ideally it's continuation, because family businesses are the backbone of our economy on the islands. So it's very crucial that the support is there.